And good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we are continuing our study of the feast days of Israel. We've been focused a great extent for the last several weeks. We've already done 100 videos now on the feast days, and for the last several, we've been focused on the Feast of Succot. The Feast of Succot, as I've shared with you, went by many different names. Feast of Harvest, Feast of Ingatherings, Feast of the Harvest, the Joy of the Nations, and it just goes on and on. So many of the different names give us different nuances into the meaning, the significance of the feast to the Jews. It was considered the feast of the greatest joy. Part of that being because it's the time of the harvest. And if the harvest has been good, then it looks to be a good year. So, like I said, there's so many nuances. So, I've been sharing with you one particular aspect of Sukkot that is extremely significant. And that is that the Feast of Sukkot was called the Feast of the Nations, or the Joy of the Nations. The reason for that is very simple. During that 7-day festival, they offered a total of 70 bulls. Pardon me. Those sacrifices represented, how to express this, prayers to Yahweh for the welfare of the nations. You see, one of the things that many commentators fail to take note of, not that they don't know it, they just don't comment on it necessarily, is that Israel believed, and this is especially true of the Second Temple period of time, but they believed that the welfare of the nations depended on the welfare of Israel. They believed that the salvation of the nations depended on the salvation of Israel. Now, this is a very biblical perspective and worldview. Now, mind you, the Jews carried that to an extreme. Some Jews went so far as to say, no, God's just going to destroy all the Gentiles. That is not the biblical perspective at all. All right? But some Jews carried that to the extent that they took the language of the Old Testament absolutely literally, that when the Messianic kingdom came, the Jews were going to rule the nations, rule the world literally, and the Gentiles would be their slaves. Now, that is absolutely not the true biblical perspective. That's why I say that some of the Jews, certainly not all of them, but some of the Jews took these concepts too far. But it was a well-known, well-established fact that the Jews, many of the Jews, might even say representatives of the Jewish concepts, believed that the welfare of the nations, the salvation of the nations, was dependent on the salvation of Israel. I believe this is why Paul said, salvation is to the Jew first, then to the Greek, Romans 1:16. And so once we understand that, then it gives us an incredible perspective on the importance of Sukkot. Matter of fact, during the actual beginning of the siege, or I should say beginning of the war, the Jewish war from 66 to 70, the Zealots prevented the sacrifice for Rome and the emperor to be offered. One of the high priests lamented the fact and said, "You don't understand. If we discontinue this, then Rome will certainly come against us because the sacrifices are made for the Gentiles. If they believe that we are rejecting that, then they will come against us for sure." This is found in Josephus. So once again, the Jews believed, there was a widespread belief in Israel that the welfare, the salvation of the nations was coextensive with the salvation of Israel. This is extremely important. So I believe that I've shared with you sufficiently about the joy of the nations and its relationship, or the meaning and connection with Succot. Well, as I point out in my book, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, there was a plethora of concepts, themes, and motifs connected with the Feast of Succot. Another one of those concepts was the how to express this. I think in my book I actually expressed it as the coronation of the king. And by the way, Margaret Barker, one of the most noted modern day scholars on the significance, the meaning of Israel's temple and the feast days, Margaret Barker says that Succot represented, symbolized, and was associated with the coronation of the king. Well, I believe there is a good deal of validity to that, and that's the reason I included it in the book. But I think it goes just a little bit deeper than that. You see, coronation is the beginning of a reign. That's when a king is, as it were, anointed. Well, Succot, as the end of the age and the time of the harvest, was not technically, and I want to emphasize this, was not technically the coronation of the king. Let me express it like this. In Acts chapter 2, the apostles and the believers were gathered together with one accord on the day of Pentecost. And suddenly there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each one of them. And there was a sound of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting, and they began to speak with other tongues, as the Holy Spirit gave them utterance. Well, the multitude that was there began to marvel, and they said, how do we hear every man in our own tongue, in our own language wherein we were born? Others scoffed and began to say, these men are drunken. But Peter, standing up with the 11, said, men and brethren, these men are not drunken as you suppose, seeing it's but the third hour of the day, but this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And he quotes Joel 2:28 to 31, or 32, excuse me, verbatim. And then he continues. He reminds them that Jesus was the Son of God, being attested by many miracles and wonders and signs which God did by him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Him being delivered through the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, you have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain, whom God has raised up. Now this is where it starts getting critical, okay? Whom God has raised up, because it was not possible for death to hold him. As David said, you will not leave my soul in Hades. Now David, knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that according to the flesh, he would raise up the Messiah, raise up the Christ to sit on his throne. He, that is Christ, is ascended and is now seated at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And he has shed forth this which you now see and hear. What's the point? As numerous scholars have pointed out, what Peter is saying is that Christ had been in fulfillment of God's promise to David to raise up the Christ to sit on his throne. When he made that promise, he was speaking of the resurrection of Christ. that promise had been fulfilled. And he said, he has received of the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that he had received the Holy Spirit from the Father? No, he already had the Holy Spirit without measure during his personal ministry, John chapter 3. So he hadn't received the Holy Spirit when he went into heaven. To reiterate, this is important, Jesus had the Spirit without measure, without any limitations, during the entirety of his ministry. So what does it mean that he had received the promise of the Holy Spirit? I believe that the most accurate understanding of that is he had received the promise to be raised from the dead and enthroned on the throne of David. In other words, when Peter says he, having been enthroned, having received the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has shed forth this which you see and hear. I believe that Peter is powerfully saying Jesus had been coronated as king. Now remember, and I got to hurry here, Luke chapter 19, Jesus understood that the Jews were all in a lather because here he is, he had spoken to Zacchaeus, and he had told Zacchaeus, this day has salvation come to your house. Well, you see, the promise of the coming of salvation was a messianic promise. So the Pharisees and the Jews were all up in the air excited because they believed that the kingdom was going to come immediately, from the Greek word parakrima, which meant they believed as Jesus went to Jerusalem, that's immediately, that's when the kingdom was going to be established. But Jesus, perceiving their understanding, said, a certain nobleman went into a far country there to receive the kingdom, to be coronated as king. Now, according to many historians and scholars, when a king was coronated, when he took the throne, what did he do? Well, of course, naturally, the argument would be, well, he began to rule. Of course he did. I'm not denying that. I'm not suggesting otherwise. By the way, there are some out there who say that Christ would not begin to rule until his parousia. That's just simply not true. A king that had been coronated was absolutely king, and he could function as king from his coronation onward. He was ruling from the moment of his coronation. But nonetheless, this nobleman went into a far country there to receive a kingdom and to return. Now, while he was there, an ambassage was sent after him, saying, we will not have this man to be ruler over us. So when he returned, having been coronated, he entered into judgment of those who said, we will not have this man to rule over us. So Jesus was seated at the right hand, having been coronated, and to return to the question, what did kings commonly do the day they were coronated, or at the time they were coronated? They gave gifts to their subjects. Not to every single one of them, that would have been impossible. But they gave gifts to selected individuals. And by the way, Ephesians chapter 4, speaking of Christ and his ascension and enthronement, said, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts to men. Do you see the perfect correlation with Acts chapter 2 and Ephesians 4? So what I'm saying here is that at his ascension and enthronement on the throne of David, Christ was coronated. That's where he received the kingdom as promised, or as he spoke in Luke chapter 19. So how does that relate to Succot? The end of the age and the parousia. Oh, it works really, really well. And we'll talk about it on the flip side. I'll see you there.